Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we will discuss the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 1st October 2019. Now before starting today's discussion, there is an announcement that there will be no DNS for tomorrow, that is 2nd October 2019 because of Gandhi Jayanti. And because of Gandhi Jayanti, there will be no newspaper for tomorrow. So we will be having the next DNS video on 3rd evening. And for today, we will be discussing these articles which are displayed on your screen. So let us start this discussion. Now this article on page number 11 is concerned about the unemployment scenario in India. And it has analyzed the reasons for higher unemployment among the age group of 15 to 29 years and also why the increase in unemployment has occurred after the year 2012. Now recently the government had released the Periodic Labour Force Survey Report or the PLFS report. And it highlights that the unemployment in India has increased to 45-year high of about 6.1%. And this increase in unemployment in the recent times has contributed to decline in the consumption expenditure and which is ultimately leading to economic slowdown. Now the author in this article highlights that the problem of unemployment has actually increased after the year 2012. So in this background, the author analyzes the current labor market scenario and also why has there been an increase in the unemployment after the year 2012. So first let us look at the employment scenario in India or the present employment scenario in India. And according to various surveys and estimates, about 471 million people are employed in India while the unemployment stands at about 30 million people. And according to the author, the unemployment in India has actually increased after the year 2012 till the year 2018. And as far as the age group which is facing the major problem of unemployment, it lies within the age group of 15 to 29. So the majority of unemployed people in India belong to the age group of 15 to 29. And these people account for about 21 million unemployed people out of the total 30 million unemployed people. So as majority of the unemployment has been found in the age group of 15 to 29, what are the reasons for such an unemployment scenario in this age group? Now the reasons for higher unemployment in the age group of 15 to 29 as highlighted by the author include increase in the number of job seekers and decrease in job creation in India. Now why has there been an increase in the number of job seekers? Now this has mainly been because of increased demand for non-agricultural jobs. And the demand for these non-agricultural jobs grew at a rate of about 14 million between the years 2005 to 2012. And this demand further increased to about 17 million between the year 2012 to 2017. Now why did this demand in the non-agricultural jobs increased? Now this mainly increased because of increase in the working age population, which is famously known as the demographic dividend. And this demographic dividend highlights that the majority of working age population in India is young in nature, and that is why this young population is demanding more jobs in non-agricultural sector. Further, the overall education scenario in the age group of 15 to 29 has been better as compared to the previous generations. And majority of people who lie in this age group are now seeking to enroll in higher education sector. And that is leading to increased job aspirations which are different from the agricultural jobs. So one of the important reasons has been increase in the aspiration of people who lie within the age group of 15 to 29. Further, in the recent past, a decline in the agricultural incomes has been witnessed. And this is one of the reasons why people have been pushed out of agricultural sector. Now, as the agricultural incomes are dropping, the people are moving out of agriculture sector and demanding jobs in sectors which are other than agriculture. And this has led to widespread rural to urban migration, and thus there has been increase in the demands for non-agricultural jobs. So few reasons for the increase in number of job seekers is the increase in demand for non-agricultural jobs, increase in the working age population, and which has been called as the demographic dividend. Further, the people who lie within this age group of 15 to 29 are seeking enrollment in higher education, which is the reason for increased aspiration. And these people are no more seeking jobs in the agricultural sector or low paid jobs. And further, the agricultural incomes are declining and which are pushing people out of agriculture into other sectors. And this is also one of the major reasons for rural-urban migration. Now, the increase in number of job seekers reflect the demand for jobs. However, as far as supply for the jobs is concerned, various factors had led to decrease in job creation in the Indian economy. Now, between the years 2005 to 2012, the construction sector emerged as one of the major drivers of employment creation, and it was able to absorb a large number of people who moved out of the agricultural sector. So people who moved out of the agricultural sector found jobs in the construction sector. And this was mainly the case between 2005 to 2012. However, after the year 2012, this construction sector has stagnated or is witnessing a kind of slowdown. And that is why this is not able to absorb the people who are moving out of the agricultural sector. And further, as we know that the agricultural sector is already facing the problem of decreased incomes or the lower incomes. And that is why it is pushing people out of this sector who are demanding jobs in other economic sectors. Now, as both the agriculture sector as well as the construction sector are witnessing slowdown, there has been decrease in the job creation in Indian economy. Now, besides slowdown in the construction and the agriculture sector, we know that manufacturing sector's contribution in the GDP has remained low in the past years. And we note that India's growth story post the liberalization, privatization, globalization reforms has mainly been driven by the improvement in the service sector. And this service sector contributes to more than 60 to 70% of the GDP in the Indian economy. Now, however, one of the major disadvantages of the service sector as far as the employment creation is concerned is that the service sector jobs are not labor intensive. And that is why they are able to employ only a limited number of people. However, the manufacturing sector has not witnessed the growth similar to that of the service sector. And we know that the manufacturing sector is a labor intensive sector and it has the potential of employing majority number of people. However, its contribution to the GDP has remained low in the past 20 to 30 years. And that is why it has led to a decrease in the job creation and the supply of jobs has remained stagnated or less in number. And this is also one of the major reasons why India's growth story has been termed as the jobless growth story. So although there has been increase in the number of job seekers, there has been decrease in the job creation and there has been a mismatch in the demand and supply in the employment market. And that is why there has been higher unemployment in the 15 to 29 age group and overall increase in the unemployment in India. Now after this, let us look at what needs to be done to improve the job creation scenario in India. Now, as we know that India has the advantage of demographic dividend. Now, what this means is that India's working age population is more as compared to the dependent population. And this dependent population include the people who are in the age group of 0 to 14 years of age and the population which has the age greater than the 60 years. So these include the children and the old age people. So India has more number of people in the working age population which lies within 18 years to 60 years in case of India. Now the people in this working age population are about 53% in India in the present times. And if this population which lies within this working age group is provided better skills and education, this can be an important driver for the economic growth in India. So the need of the hour is creation of large number of formal jobs. This is mainly because the education level in India is increasing and people are now seeking the formal jobs and are moving out of the agricultural sector. And also as more number of people are now enrolling in higher education, there is a need of creation of well-paying jobs. Now to improve the employability of the people who lie within this working age population group, or which can be called as the demographic dividend, the government should focus on increasing the investment in human capital formation. And such investments will include promotion of skills, education, and health in India. And finally, the government should focus on the revival of micro, small, and medium enterprises sector. This is because it is one of the most labor intensive sectors in India and contributes to majority of formal employment in India. And that is why the government's focus should be on the revival of this MSME sector. So in this article, the author has analyzed the issue of unemployment and also has provided certain suggestions to improve this situation. With this, let's take up the next article. This article on page number 11 talks about the Draft Model Tenancy Act, and it has outlined various limitations and has provided suggestions for improving this Model Tenancy Act. So this will form a part of the General Studies paper 2 under the topic Governance. Now, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs had recently released this Draft Model Tenancy Act, and it is seeking feedback from public and various stakeholders regarding this. And this act aims to balance the interests and rights of both the owners as well as the tenants. And it also aims to create an accountable and transparent ecosystem for renting the premises. Further, this act is likely to help the migrant workers, both the informal as well as the formal migrant workers. Besides this, it aims at helping the professionals, students, and the businesses in India. Thirdly, it aims at formalizing the rent housing market, which mainly remains in the hand of informal sector in Indian economy. And finally, it seeks to encourage the private participation in the rental housing, and that is likely to solve the crisis of housing in India. So in this article, let us try and understand the key provisions of this Draft Model Tenancy Act. And further, we will look at the analysis of this Model Tenancy Act, what are its limitations according to the authors, and also what are the ways to improve this Model Tenancy Act. Here it is also important to note that the government is aiming to achieve the housing for all by 2022. Now in this scenario, we know that not everybody can afford a house, and that is why the rental market becomes extremely important. So besides providing housing for all by the various schemes of the government, for example the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, it is important for government to focus on the tenancy reforms, and that is where this Model Tenancy Act becomes extremely important. Now the key provisions which have been released by the Ministry of Housing Affairs include, first is that this Model Tenancy Act provides for a robust grievance redressal mechanism, and it will provide various provisions for rent authority, rent court, and rent tribunals. And these rent authorities, courts, and tribunals will look after the matters related to renting and tenancy issues in India. Secondly, it has proposed to cap the security deposit, which remains a major issue with the tenants in India. And that is why they have capped this security deposit, and that will be equal to maximum of 2 months rent in case of residential properties and minimum of 1 month's rent in case of non-residential or the commercial properties. Thirdly, as and when this Model Tenancy Act will come into force, no person shall let or take on rent any premises except by an agreement in the writing. So it has made the agreement for tenancy compulsory. And thirdly, this will be applicable to whole state, and it will be applicable to both the urban areas as well as the rural areas in any of the states. Further, both the landowners and the tenants are required to intimate the rent authority about the agreement within 2 months of executing this rental agreement. And as and when the rent authority is intimated, it will provide them a unique identification number. And so there will be a unique identification number for each rental agreement that takes place. And finally, the government proposes a digital platform that will be set up in local vernacular languages of the states for submitting these tenancy agreements and other documents which are related to these agreements. So these are a few provisions which have been provided by the Ministry of Housing Affairs. However, it is still in the process of taking views of various stakeholders and public in this regard. So in this backdrop, this article analyzes the issues with this Model Tenancy Act and has provided various suggestions to improve this Model Tenancy Act. So let us look at these points. Now, some of the limitations which have been highlighted by the authors regarding the Model Tenancy Act include: the first is that majority of tenancies in India are informal in nature, which means that such tenancies do not have any formal or written agreements. Now, as majority of the tenancies in India are of informal nature, the authors have argued that bringing in such a Model Tenancy Act can have two major consequences. So either a majority of rental agreements might continue to be unregistered, which means that they will not follow the line of the Model Tenancy Act and will still be involved in such informal tenancy agreements. Now, another consequence of such an act could be that such informal tenancies could now opt for formalizing their tenancies through an agreement. However, such formalization of tenancies could lead to an increase in the rents on the market. So by formalizing the various informal tenancies, there is a chance that there will be an increase in the overall rents in the market. Secondly, the authors have argued about the limitations of bringing in the rent courts and the rent tribunals. Now, as we know that the Model Tenancy Act provides for rent authority, rent courts and rent tribunals. However, in this regard, the authors have argued that the jurisdiction of such courts and tribunals is of limited nature. And these courts and tribunals will be able to hear cases which will be limited only to the tenancy agreements which are submitted to the rent authority, which will be created by this Model Tenancy Act. However, the jurisdiction of these courts do not extend to older tenancies or to those tenancies which are of informal nature. So this shows that there is limitation to the jurisdictions of such courts and tribunals. And due to the limitations of these rent courts, the twin problem of resolving the older disputes regarding tenancies as well as the problem of informal agreements and arrangements regarding the tenancies will keep on continuing. So in short, the limitations of the Model Tenancy Act is that majority of the people will not enter into formal tenancy agreements. Secondly, even if the agreements are formalized, it will lead to an increase in the rents in the market. And further, there is limitation of jurisdiction for the newly created rent courts or the rent tribunals. This is because they will not have any jurisdiction over older tenancy disputes or the informal arrangements and agreements regarding the tenancies in India. Now, what are the suggestions which have been provided by the authors to make the Model Tenancy Act more inclusive and solve the problem of renting in India? So first is that they have highlighted the need for addressing the issue of vacant houses or the vacancy. And for this, these authors have suggested that the government's focus or the act's focus should be on higher end of the rental market. Now, as far as high-end rental market is concerned in the urban areas, there is about 10% vacancy in this high-end rental market. However, as far as the slums are concerned in the urban areas, this vacancy is about 7.3% only. And according to the 2011 census, almost 1.1 crore houses were vacant in India. So this highlights that because of lack of formal agreements and because of lack of a proper Model Tenancy Act, there has been issue of renting out of such houses. And by addressing these issues and putting these vacant houses to renting, it can solve the problem of housing in India and especially in the urban areas. So in this regard, the authors have suggested that the Act needs to focus on the higher end of the rental market to fill in these vacancies. And an effective implementation of the Act in the upper segments of the housing market will allow some of these vacant houses to enter the rental market, and this will serve to relieve the massive amount of pressure and demand on the lower segments. And this is because majority of the people still rely on these lower segment market, and that is why this lower segment is already overcrowded. So by focusing on the higher end of the rental market, the government can relieve this pressure on the low end rental market. Further, it is highlighted that there is a need for differentiating commercial tenancy with that of the residential ones. And in this, both have their own inherent logic. For example, the commercial tenancy focuses more on attracting institutional investments or economic development. However, as far as the residential tenancies are concerned, these are largely held by individuals and households, and their main focus is not regarding the investments in the economy. Further, these residential arrangements in the urban areas offer security of tenure, access to livelihood, health and education. So the residential arrangements mainly focus on the social issues. However, the commercial arrangements focus mainly on the economic development. So in this regard, as the Model Tenancy Act does not differentiate between the commercial tenancy and the residential tenancy, the authors have suggested that there is a need for differentiating both these types of tenancies, and ultimately the focus of the Act or the Model Tenancy Act should be on streamlining the commercial tenancy as well as the residential tenancy separately. Now, besides these measures, the main focus should be on increasing the supply of formal as well as affordable rental houses. And this will require huge amount of investment on the part of both the central governments as well as the state governments. However, as we know that when the government acts as a supplier of services, there are issues of corruption and delays. So that is why the authors have highlighted that prior experience of renting shows that publicly involved rental housing will need structure efforts in management, planning and design in order to achieve the inclusive agenda for housing. And further, the government can draw inspiration from various examples of different countries. And many countries across the world have focused on housing built to rent for migrants, for low-wage informal and formal workers, students, rent-to-own housing for unsteady low-wage households, and even rental housing allowances or vouchers for the most marginalized in the housing market. So this will make the housing agenda more inclusive in nature. And that is how the supply of formal affordable rental housing can be achieved by the government. So these were few issues and the suggestions which were provided by the authors regarding the Model Tenancy Act, which has been brought out by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. Now, as this Model Act is still in draft format, let us wait for this act to be finalized in the Parliament. So this is a news in transition. And with this, let's take up the next article. Now, this article on page number 15 is in news in the context of a report which was released by the Reserve Bank of India. And this report is titled The State Finances, a study of budgets of 2019 and 20. So it is an annual publication which provides information, analysis and an assessment of the finances of the state governments. So it mainly highlights what are the fiscal deficits of various state governments, how are the governments doing in achieving these fiscal deficit targets which are set by the FRBM Acts. So this will fall under the General Studies paper 3 under the topic Economic Development. And let us look at the key highlights of this report of the RBI. And this can be important for us from the mains examination point of view. So let us look at the key highlights of this State Finances report of the RBI. Now first, in this regard, it highlights the status of gross fiscal deficit targets. Now the FRBM Act or the Fiscal Responsibility and the Budget Management Act has provided the target of 3% of GDP as the target for fiscal deficit. So in this regard, the gross fiscal deficit of the state governments or the consolidated state gross fiscal deficit was 2.9% of the GDP and was within the targets which are set by the FRBM Act. Further, this was only about 2.4% of the GDP in the year 2017 and 18. And as far as the projections are concerned, it will be about 2.6% of the GDP in the year 2019 and 20. However, there are concerns even when the targets of the gross fiscal deficit are within the targets set by the FRBM Act. And this is mainly because the state governments are underestimating their expenditure by decreasing capital expenditure. And this decrease in the fiscal deficit is mainly on the account of cut down in the capital expenditures by the state governments. However, as far as the revenue expenditure is concerned, there has been an increase in the revenue expenditure. Now, this decrease in the capital expenditure raises the concern because the state governments account for almost 2/3 of the total capital expenditure in the Indian economy. And 1/3 of this capital expenditure is contributed by the central government. So this shows that the capital expenditure by the state governments is also important. However, the state governments have been cutting down this capital expenditure in order to meet their fiscal deficit targets which are set by the FRBM Act. Now here it is important to note that the capital expenditures are extremely important for the growth of Indian economy. And this is because such an expenditure by the governments is used for creating infrastructure and various assets for the government. However, the increase in revenue expenditure does not lead to the creation of any infrastructure or the assets. And this is basically the cost of running the government. And that is why this decline in the capital expenditure is a major concern for the Indian economy. And further, the Indian economy is facing an economic slowdown. And in this background, there is a need for stepping up government expenditure on the creation of capital assets, and which will in turn increase the private sector investments and also increase the demand in Indian economy. Now, as far as the revenue expenditure is concerned, there has been increase in the overall revenue expenditure by the states, mainly because of increase in interest payments as well as payments of salaries and pensions of the government officials. However, such an expenditure is not taken in good light as far as the economic growth is concerned. So the government should mainly focus on increasing their capital expenditure. Now, although the status of the gross fiscal deficit of the state governments is within the limit which has been set by the FRBM Act, there is a concern that the governments have been doing so and meeting these targets by decreasing their capital expenditures. And that is not a good sign for the Indian economy. And besides decreasing their capital expenditure, the revenue expenditure of the state governments is increasing day by day. And that poses a major concern for the Indian economy and the state finances. Now, the second thing which is highlighted by this report of RBI is the status of debt of the state governments. And as far as the outstanding debts of the state government is concerned, it has risen over the last 5 years to about 25% of the GDP. Now, recently a panel was created for suggestions on the FRBM Act, and this panel was known as the Singh panel, and it had suggested that the overall public debt to GDP ratio should be about 60% by the year 2022 to 23. And this 60% debt should include 40% for the central government, while there should be only 20% contribution to this debt from the state governments. However, the present situation shows that the state governments currently have 25% share in the debt. Now, what is meant by this term debt? So, you should note that the governments usually spend more as compared to their earnings. And this is what creates the fiscal deficit. And this fiscal deficit will have to be returned back in the near future. So, this gets accumulated year on year. And this accumulation of fiscal deficit results in debt. So, fiscal deficit reflects the debt of the government for only 1 year. However, the debt reflects the overall liability of the government which it has to repay. So, this overall debt or the liabilities of the state governments currently stands at about 25% of the GDP. However, as suggested by the Singh panel, this should be within 20% limits for the state governments. And this target, which was suggested by the Singh panel, has to be achieved by the year 2022 to 23. Now, what needs to be done to achieve these targets? So, the state governments should now focus on revenue generation to reduce their debt liability and should enhance their capital expenditure. And this is what has been suggested by this RBI's report. And further, to increase the revenue generation for the state governments, they will have to impose user charges on various services which are provided by the state governments. And also, these governments should focus on the technological measures to improve the tax collection efficiency. And that is the only way in which the state governments can increase their revenue. So, these points highlight the status of the consolidated gross fiscal deficit and the overall debts of the state governments. So, it is important for the state governments to pursue their capital expenditure plans as budgeted in the year 2019 and 20. However, considering that these state governments account for about 2/3 of the total government capital expenditure, it is important that the governments do not cut down these capital expenditures. So these are a few points highlighted by the RBI's report regarding the status of the debts and the fiscal deficits of the state governments. So all these points mentioned here can be used in answering questions related to government finances. With this, let's take up the next article. Now, this article on page number 10 highlights the importance of judicial review for India. And this is based on the episode which has happened in the England regarding the Brexit issue. So in this article, the author has highlighted how is executive in India violating the parliamentary process, and in that scenario, why is judicial review and activism important. So this will form a part of the General Studies paper 2 under the topic Polity and Constitution. Now first let us understand the episode which happened in the United Kingdom and also understand what is the importance of this episode for all other countries which follow the same system as that of the UK, which is famously known as the Westminster form of the government or the prime ministerial form of government. Now here it is important to note that the present Prime Minister of UK, Boris Johnson, favoured the exit of Britain from the European Union. So in short, he favoured the Brexit from EU. Now to avoid a debate on this issue, he prorogued the parliament without even a debate on the Brexit issue. And this matter was brought in front of the Supreme Court of UK. So in this background, the Supreme Court had declared this prorogation of parliament by the British Prime Minister as unlawful on the grounds of parliamentary sovereignty and democratic accountability. This is because the Prime Minister was trying to take a decision even without a debate in the Parliament. Now, this step of the British Prime Minister was termed as unconstitutional or unlawful because it stood opposed to the democratic accountability in a parliamentary system. And this is mainly because the Parliament is the most important arena of debate and it holds the executive accountable. So, this prorogation of Parliament by the British Prime Minister was seen as curbing the power of Parliament or reducing the power or the debating power of the Parliament. So in short, he tried to reduce the democratic accountability of the British government. So in short, he tried to reduce the democratic accountability of the British government to the British Parliament. So the decision of prorogation of the British Parliament by the British Prime Minister was challenged in the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court had timely intervened in this matter. And it has declared that decision of the Prime Minister as unlawful. So now what are the lessons for other democracies which are following the same prime ministerial form of government as far as this Supreme Court decision of the UK is concerned? So this decision basically underlines the effectiveness of the judicial review process, and this is mainly because it was conducted in a time-bound manner and also it has ensured the accountability of the executive to the Parliament. Further, it has restored the confidence in the Parliament in a democracy. Secondly, the Supreme Court of UK had asserted that prorogation of the Parliament by the British Prime Minister was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional function of accountability, and that too without giving a reasonable justification. So the author suggests that those countries which are following the same system as that of the British system, that is the Westminster form of government or the prime ministerial form of government, this judgment calls for increased introspection of executive actions. And it also provides a boost to the parliamentary processes. So in this background, let us try and understand how is the executive in India violating these parliamentary processes. So according to the author, the government has taken two major decisions which were passed in hurry without proper legislative scrutiny. The first one was the Constitution's 103rd Amendment Act of 2019, which provided the reservation for economically weaker sections. And this matter was not properly debated in the Parliament. And secondly, the decision of abrogating Article 370 of the Indian Constitution and introducing the Jammu and Kashmir State Reorganization Bill 2019. And this too was passed in hurry and was introduced without legislative scrutiny. Now, what are the conventions regarding passing of a bill in the Parliament? So the convention is that the legislative documents are provided at least a few days before they are tabled in the Parliament to the Member of Parliament. And this provides the Member of Parliaments to understand the contents of the legislations, seek their views and formulate their positions in the final law. And such understanding of the various legislations by the Member of Parliaments allows for debate in the Parliament. And that is how the members of the Parliament hold the executive accountable. However, by passing such laws in hurry without proper legislative scrutiny amounts to decrease in the power or the position of parliament as compared to that of executive government. Further, the Rule 69 of the Rajya Sabha mentions about the motions after the introduction of bills, and also it mentions about the scope of debate. However, as per the rule, discretion has been given to chairman in the exceptional situations where the bills can be passed in a hurry. However, this use of discretion by the chairman is only for exceptional situations and not for normal legislative processes. So, such discretionary power requires that the chairman uses this power judiciously and with proper application of mind. Now, as these conventions and the Rule 69 of the Rajya Sabha has not been followed in the matters of passing of these laws, such laws can be challenged in the Supreme Court and can be subject to judicial review or judicial scrutiny. And in this background, the action taken by the Supreme Court of UK becomes extremely important. And this decision of the Supreme Court of UK sets an example for other democracies like India, which are following the British system of parliament and the government. And this is mainly because the Supreme Court of UK took a judicial review on a very important and crucial issue for Britain. Secondly, it took that decision in a time-bound manner. And that is why it is an example for countries like India, where these norms are being flouted and there is not a proper debate on various legislative matters. And the Supreme Court's decision to allow the Parliament to decide and debate the issue of Brexit has upheld the principles of democratic accountability and of a sovereign parliament. And this sets a stage and also is a very important example for Indian democracy and the parliamentary process. Now, various aspects of the Westminster system of government or the prime ministerial form of government have been provided in today's PDF. However, to understand the whole issue, you should go through the M. Lakshmikant and try and understand the parliamentary system that is prevalent in India, and also how are various bills passed in the parliament. And that is how you will be able to easily understand this article and the importance of the decision of the Supreme Court of UK. And also you should go through the chapter of judicial review in the M. Lakshmikant book. With this, let's move to the next article. Now, this article on page number 1 is related to a recent rankings of the state governments regarding the quality of education based on an index of the NITI Aayog, which is known as the School Education Quality Index or SEQI. So, this will form a part of General Studies paper 2 under the topic Issues Relating to Education and Human Resources. So, here we will try to understand the key aspects of the SEQI index and what are the results of this ranking highlighting. Now, this School Education Quality Index is basically an output-based education index and it is compiled by the NITI Aayog. So, this aspect is particularly important for us from the preliminary examination point of view. And it mainly provides the information regarding the quality of education which is being imparted in various states of India. So based on this index, the NITI Aayog releases a ranking of different states. And this index measures the performance of the states regarding the quality of school education based on 30 indicators. And this is compiled on the basis of data from the National Achievement Survey. Now, what are the main parameters on which this index? Which this index uses? So it has mainly 30 indicators which can be clubbed under the 4 parameters, which are first the learning outcomes, second is the access to education, third is the infrastructure and facilities related to the education, and how far is the education system equitable in a state. So after this, let us look at the rankings of various states in this regard, or basically the trend of rankings. Now, as far as the rankings are concerned, in the large states, Kerala and Rajasthan are the top performers. However, the worst performance amongst the larger states is of the UP, that is the Uttar Pradesh, Jammu and Kashmir, Punjab and that of Bihar. In the smaller states and union territories, Manipur is the best performer. However, Arunachal Pradesh is the worst performer. and among the union territories, Chandigarh has the best performance. Now, what is the significance and the impact of this SEQI index? So let us look at that. And as far as the impact or the likely impact of this index is concerned, it is expected that such an index will encourage the states to adopt outcome-based and result-oriented policies. This is mainly because they will be judged based on the outcomes of the learnings or the education will be judged based on this index. And other indices which are adopted by the Ministry of Human Resource Development are mainly focused on input-based parameters, for example, the quality of infrastructure, etc. However, this is a major initiative towards outcome-based policies. And this is mainly because 50% weightage has been given to learning outcomes in this index. Further, as we know that education is a part of concurrent list, and by providing such an index, it is expected that it will foster the spirit of competitive federalism between different states. Further, such an index can be used as a benchmark for disbursing performance-linked grants to the states. And further, the central government is planning to collaborate with the World Bank to offer performance-linked grants to the states as an incentive for high ranking in this index. And also this will act as a knowledge sharing of best practices of the high ranking states with that of low performing states. So these are some of the likely impacts of development of such an index by the NITI Aayog and the comparative ranking that it provides. So these were few aspects. However, important for preliminary examination is the body which releases this index and the rankings based on that index, and which is the NITI Aayog. With this, let's take up the next article. Now, after today's discussion, let us take up these questions from our preliminary examination point of view, and the answer will be displayed after 5 seconds. Now, the first question is related to the current account deficit, and this is based on the article on page number 15, and the basics of current account deficit have already been discussed in a previous DNS video. So this question is based on NCERT. So which of the following are included in the calculation of current account deficit? So if you go through the 6th chapter of the macroeconomics NCERT of class 12th, you will find various details related to balance of payment. And here it is important to note that foreign direct investment in India and foreign portfolio investment in India are not included in the calculation of current account deficit. However, they are used in the calculation of capital account deficit. So that is why the correct answer here is that trade in invisibles will be included in the calculation of current account deficit. That is third. So the correct answer is A, that is 3 only. The second question is related to core sector growth, and this news article is on page number 15, and this has also been discussed previously in a DNS video. So the question reads, consider the following statements about index of 8 core industries. The first is that the base year for the calculation of this index is 2011-12, which is correct. Second is coal and cement sectors are included in this index, which is also correct. So the correct answer is both 1 and 2. Third question is pretty straightforward. School education quality index is calculated by which of the following? So it is the NITI Aayog which calculates this. Last question is which of the following are included under the revenue receipts for the union budget? Now here it is important to note that the corporate tax are the tax revenues, while cash grant in aid from foreign countries and international organizations are non-tax revenues for the union government. And these are included in revenue receipts. However, the disinvestment of the public sector enterprises is included in the capital account, or they are known as the capital receipts. That is why the third statement is incorrect. Hence the correct answer is B, that is 1 and 2 only. So with this we conclude today's discussion. Now let's take up the question for the day.